Welcome to People Space Podcast with me, Winston Mavoro, and 2026 has begun on a very good note. In fact, it looks very promising and exciting. Exciting in the sense that I am privileged to be hosting for the very first edition and episode of the year, none other than Mbaita Maka, who is the programs manager at Development Getaway, and obviously Mbaita, it is very exciting. I'm particularly happy because, oftentimes we do get to host men as the majority of the guests on this particular platform, but to have a woman start the year, it's a signal for good things. So I'm particularly excited and it's great to have you and welcome to the People Space Podcast.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. And I'm looking forward to having a wonderful chat with you today. I'm definitely happy to be the first guest of 2016 and excited that it's a female guest kicking off the year.
Exactly. Exciting chat is what is in store for you. And before we get right into it, I'd like to remind all of you to be able to make sure that you take time to be interactive on our platforms where these episodes air. We are talking Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and Twitter, which is now X. And all you have to do is, if your comment garners enough traction on those particular platforms in relation to the topics that we discuss on different episodes, you do stand a chance of winning amazing prizes ranging from t-shirts, mug cups, exciting memorabilia, so to speak. And in fact, in 2026, we have exciting prizes that we will get to mention as we get in the course of these conversations. So to start our discussion, Baita, we have a tradition on this particular platform. First and foremost, we know that in development finance, you are obviously a household name. I mean, the works speak for themselves, okay? But there are people that could be meeting you for the very first time on this particular platform, and they would want to know who you are. So, just let us in a little bit on your professional journey.
Yes, absolutely. So my name is Mbaita Maka, as you introduced me. Not quite a household name, as you put it, but I've been in the space of development finance for upwards of 13 years. My career began working in equity markets. And from that, I think I really got a grounded understanding of financial markets, what drives them, the different incentives that exist. But I think underlying kind of my core belief system is belief in fairness, issues of equity, and issues of sustainability. So that took me towards a career in development finance, where we look more into how can we translate economic growth, not just into economic growth for the sake of it, but rather into economic development, and ensure that we're bringing vulnerable populations with us along. So I transitioned into a career in development finance, working particularly in public health. But I have since also worked exhaustively in areas of rural development and also issues around digital transformation.
That's pretty much exciting. But you see, the funny thing I like about people like you is that you always try to be modest. But when I ask you a very good question, like tell us a bit about yourself, you sell yourself. So you are a household name.
One day we'll
All
work on
right.
it.
Okay, so still on, your career path, and one of the things I like is often these spaces, are occupied, generally by the male folk. And in some quarters, there's still a perception that, when we talk about development finance, when we talk about careers like this, generally women have this perception like, so to really see a person like you be able to find footing in this particular career is encouraging, for a lot of our women folk out there. And looking at where you're coming from academically, having been, to the Stellenbosch School of Business, having gone to the University of Cape Town, how has this journey academically shaped, your approach to development and economic growth? I'll get back to what you said, in your opening where you talked about, economic growth and how it translates to the vulnerable. So how has this shaped your approach when we talk about development, economic growth?
Yeah, so my academic training started post secondary school. Started at the University of Cape
What
Town.
school were you at, by the way?
I studied in South Africa,
Ah,
actually.
wonderful.
Yes, I
Okay.
studied in South Africa. And then I moved to the University of Cape Town, where I did an undergraduate degree in economics. And so that really gave me firm footing and grounded my understanding of economic theory, both micro and macroeconomic theory. And then, obviously, post tertiary education, I started my career. And I think, as I've already indicated, I started asking a lot of questions around how are we going to translate economic growth into development, and what are the underlying challenges, and how do we fix them? And so that led me towards wanting to undertake a degree, a master's degree in development finance, which I did at the Stellenbosch University, as you indicated. And I think this really helped me really just like ground my understanding and my belief systems around the need for us to really address market imperfections, really. And grounded, obviously in solid, economic theory, but how do we actually address some of these barriers to access and resource allocation challenges that we're grappling with, especially in, underdeveloped economies like Zambia. So actually one of the things that one of the things that I did in my during my master's studies was I did a study on catastrophic health expenditure in Zambia and financial protection. So it really, I guess, it crystallized my belief in addressing the issues, addressing the issues and challenges of the vulnerable. And it also crystallized my belief that if you're not moving with the least, the what's how do I put it? If you're not moving with the people who have the least resources, with if growth is not moving with those people, then it's really not working for anybody ultimately. So yeah.
So, maybe lastly on your career, I know there's a whole lot that we can unpack on that just alone, but what has been the defining moment in your 13-year career so far?
Wow, defining. That's a, I'm not sure about defining, but I think one of the things that I've worked on that I've been very proud of, and that actually still stays with me even today, and I carry with me in my current work, which we'll talk about, I know, a little bit later, is supporting with the earlier work around social health insurance. So this was really trying to address and build the foundations for what now became NEMA. But in my earlier work at Chai, we did some work around defining the benefits package, trying to figure out how we can make sure that we are looking at issues of efficiency and issues of sustainability around funding health and health financing. And that work has since translated, of course, with a lot of other processes over time, into what is now NEMA. And so I think seeing how evidence based decision making can really translate into something positive has been one of the things that I'm really proud of and the highlight of my career.
Interesting. You mentioned something very, very important, development and economic growth. I've heard people that would, you know, maybe loosely understand these two terms to mean the same thing,
Yeah.
and sometimes used interchangeably in certain, context. W- Are they different? What is development? What is economic growth?
Good question. So, economic growth is really just a number. So we can say the GDP of Zambia has grown by, 10% annually over a period of 5 years. That's economic growth. Can't be disputed. It's an objective fact. But has that led to development? That's now, I would say it's also an objective question, but we start looking at things like health outcomes. As has that growth translated to people being well? Has that led to a decrease in mortality rates? Has that led to people having access to finance? Has that led to rural development? More people having more access to electricity? Those sorts of questions. So now those are the markers of development. But economic growth on its own is really just a figure. It's really just a number saying that, year over year, more has been produced by the economy. But how that translates to people's actual real lives is not captured when we discuss economic growth alone.
Okay. So at Development Getaway, you've worked on data driven development strategies. Just briefly share with us, what the Tobacco Control Data Initiative is, why was it created, and the key data gaps it aims to fill in tobacco control access in Africa. One of the things that you mentioned is you've been active in public health space as well. So,
Yeah. The Tobacco Control Data Initiative is a program that's actually been running for a number of years, since 2019, I believe. It initially started in 4 countries, expanded to 6, and now we're in 7 countries. So we basically developed an online platform to consolidate data on tobacco control. So we consolidated data across many themes of tobacco control. And the ultimate goal of it is to ensure that policymakers have access to credible data so that they can make evidence-based decisions for policy. Yeah,
okay.
that's the
So when when you talk about policymakers having access to this brilliant initiative, like in the case of Zambia, in the practical aspect of it, would you just kind of let us in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. When we talk about the different themes of tobacco control, so there are issues about like the prevalence, there's issues of taxation, there's issues of industry interference, illicit trade. Because there's a very strong tobacco industry, it's difficult sometimes to find information that is actually credible. Misinformation is very prevalent. So the idea is that we needed one source of truth where we can actually have verified, validated data, and that can act as the source of truth for what is actually prevailing in Zambia as far as the use of tobacco and nicotine. And that can be used as a basis to make decisions to further the public's interest. Because as we know, tobacco actually the highest risk factor for non-communicable diseases.
So when we talk about this same brilliant initiative, obviously data is one of the critical component when we talk about advocacy, and you mentioned access for policymakers. Does this initiative only, is access reserved for policymakers alone, or you have maybe key figures in society, that play a key role in terms of sensitization? So who can have access to this?
So it's actually available publicly. So it's online. So it's available to anybody who needs it, whether it's people for academic reasons. But our target is really to drive policy. So majority of the users are advocates of tobacco control policy. So they use this to actually take very complex issues around tobacco and nicotine use and translate it into simple messaging that they can use for their advocacy to drive positive change. Yeah.
I'm trying to phrase this question um, in the most diplomatic way. Still talking about the practicality of the Tobacco Control Data Initiative dashboard, and so what kinds of data indicators are available, and how can policymakers access and interpret this information? And I'm interested mostly in the last part. Policymakers interpreting this information because, like I said, I'm trying to be as diplomatic as possible. Sometimes we have very, we've got people that are in these positions, but sometimes their understanding of things can be very questionable, going by what we see, the quality of debates and conversations that we see sometimes in the public space by these policymakers.
Yeah.
So what kind of data indicators are available, and how easy is it for policymakers to interpret this particular information?
That's a very good question. So actually, that's really at the core of why we decided to go for this initiative, is to have data that's easy to interpret. So we've taken quite a great effort to make sure that we use data visualization. Everything is in charts. Everything is very we use a lot of infographics so that the messaging is very clear, substantiated but clear. And we've gone to the great lengths to make sure that it's as simple and easy to use. So anyone who can access the platform, the key messages really come out at you. And you can, of course, dive deeper and read into the narratives, etc. But the key messages really are easy and come through quite quickly when you access the platform. So the hope is that policymakers will have no issues with interpretation, and that given the credibility of the data, that the recommended actions will be quite clear.
Okay. Um, from that, obviously, it is encouraging that that is the state of affairs. Do we then, or has there been some progress? Say when this was established, has there been some progress that you can point at and say, okay, ever since we created this initiative, policymakers have had the opportunity to interface with this particular information that has then led to this policy that we can point to here?
Yeah. So as of right now, I think the status is that the bill is yet to be tabled in Parliament, but will be tabled in the current sitting. But leading up to that, there has been extensive use of the data on the dashboard for advocacy and in the build up to the different processes that go into passing legislation or other policy. So yes, I think our data around the data that we have on the dashboard around taxation and the different policy options has been showcased, and there's been active engagement. Even the bodies such as the Zambia Revenue Authority are aware of it and have active engagement with it. As part of the program, we've done an observational study around cigarette packs to understand the prevalence of illicit sales of cigarettes. So this is an important thing because there's a lot of contention around the prevalence of illicit sales of cigarettes. There's I get there's in other parts of the world we've seen that the industry has an interest in having an inflated figure for illicit trade, or showcasing an inflated figure. But we're able to establish for Zambia that there's an illicit rate of about 12.2%. So just having that figure and accurate and credible is something that has been used extensively by advocates to actually at least showcase the real picture when debates come up around issues of illicit trade and taxation, etc. So those are some of the examples of how it's actually being used in to drive policy. And I think we continue to hope that it's a living platform. So this is not something where we just developed information and put it on the dashboard and left it there. It's continuously updated as soon as new information becomes available. It's updated, and not just on the content, but when additional themes emerge, like new and emerging nicotine and tobacco products is now a very big theme. Vaping has become a very big trend in Zambia. So now we have a dedicated page looking at these new and emerging nicotine and tobacco products. So it's a living platform, and it will continue to be a living platform. So even once policy is enacted, issues of enforcement will start to be more prominent, and the dashboard will showcase how Zambia is doing around issues of enforcement and provide data that can be used to help us do better.
Before we take a break, I can't help but wrap around my mind the 12% that you mentioned with regards illicit trade. How does that, drawing from your knowledge and experience in the field of economics, how does that disadvantage our country economically?
Yeah, so illicit trade, of course, is it's something that we need to curtail, of course, because we know that we are trying to reduce the consumption of tobacco and nicotine products because they have a health burden on our system, so we can do that through legal products, right? By increasing the tax rate, for example, there are levers that we can pull to address issues of consumption. But now with illicit products, they distort the pricing of of cigarettes. So that is a problem because essentially it dampens our what we can do in terms of policy to address the challenges of tobacco and nicotine use. So it's something that we definitely want to curtail, and so enforcement of the tax systems and tax administration is very important as part of that. So that's where the issue of illicit trade comes in. It's really something that we really need to monitor and address. And that's the importance of that figure. It's good to know what that figure is so that we make sure that we trend the correct way, which is downwards.
You are watching the People Space podcast with me, Wenson Mavori, and my guest today is Mbaita Maka, all the way from Gateway Development. She is a programs manager over there. And of course, we are looking at the Tobacco Control Data Initiative and, of course, discussing not only defining what this initiative is, but also examining how it can enhance important aspects such as advocacy and also informing policymakers with regards the journey that Zambia has been on for some time, which is enacting a tobacco control legislation. And we are understanding the nexus between this particular initiative and how it can help us reach the promised land when it comes to that particular journey. So remember, before we see you on the other side, you can win yourself some amazing and fantastic prizes. And I did mention earlier on that this year we have some new prizes in our catalog that we'll be able to announce later on in the episodes as we go on in the year. But all you simply have to do is be active on the platforms that we do broadcast the People's Space podcast, and that is YouTube, Facebook, under the handle the Center for Trade Policy and Development. And when we talk TikTok, X, and other platforms, it is CTPD Zambia. If your comment garners enough traction on those platforms, you might just be that lucky winner that may get yourself those exciting and fantastic prizes. And beyond that, we do, by the way, also offer you an opportunity, assuming you wanted to have a lengthy conversation with our guests, such as Mbaita herself, we can make that possible as a part of the prizes that we give to the people that interact with us more often. So see you on the other side shortly.
Hello, viewers. I'm Fitzpatrick Apepe, Director, Strategy and Business Development at ZESCO. We'll be discussing issues around the energy sector, a lot of things that you may actually be interested in knowing about power trading, how tariffs are derived, the opportunities in the electricity sector on the People's Space. So join us on the People's Space.
Welcome back to People Space Podcast. Today we are looking at the Tobacco Control Data Initiative, and to provide us with understanding on what this exactly is no other than the energetic and vibrant Mbaita Maka, all the way from Gateway Development. She is Programs Manager over there. Maka, obviously we left off looking at how this initiative can be able to just, play a critical role when it comes to advancing tobacco control in the country. And whilst on that, in your view, why is evidence-based data so critical for developing effective tobacco control policy, particularly in African countries such as Zambia?
Yeah, I think evidence-based decision making is really important because it's really critical that we ground our decision making in facts and in real and not perceived realities. And so, for tobacco control in particular, where there's a lot of misinformation, credible data can sometimes be difficult to find. In particular, there's different methodologies even across countries of how this data is collected. So it's very easy to murky the waters. And so it's really critical that we actually have a source of truth that we can come to, and that can be used to drive our decisions. Because ultimately, these are decisions around public interest. As I think I earlier mentioned, tobacco use is one of the critical risk factors for non-communicable diseases, and that's something that our health system is grappling with right now. Both from a human life perspective, but even from an economic perspective, treating these diseases and the costs to the economy of treating cancers and the various things that tobacco use causes, has a very real implications on us all. So it's important that as we make the policy, define the policies and enforce those policies, that we know the true picture, and that's really what's what's kind of anchoring us as we proceed.
So obviously, tobacco control is the goal. And if you look at, one of the things that you've mentioned, which I'm really excited about this initiative, is the fact that besides being a source of credible data, it is also a source that can be used to debunk a lot of myths out there. Among young people, there's a whole lot of misinformation. Vaping looks cool. It doesn't expose you to certain, non-communicable risks. When it comes to diseases, there's all this misinformation. So, do young people are there deliberate efforts to make this platform known to young people so that they can have access to some of information that can be able to debunk some of these, data, that they have, which is completely wrong and endangers their life altogether?
Absolutely. And, I'm glad you mentioned that because I think initiation of tobacco use starts when you're young. Majority of people who, are lifelong smokers and, and struggle to quit later on in life started to smoke as youth, as early as 10 years old sometimes, they start to smoke very young. And, obviously the scientific evidence shows that when you start to smoke or use tobacco, let me not just smoking, all sorts of uses of tobacco, because we know that the use of tobacco has evolved. We know that it's very, very difficult to quit because essentially you get hooked when your brain has not developed to its full capacity. So the research shows that if you can delay initiation of any use of tobacco, automatically we reduce even just the likelihood of somebody becoming addicted. So to your question around what we're doing to ensure that this information is widely disseminated, particularly to the youth, I think we're working very closely with the civil society organizations broadly, but more specifically youth civil society organizations who are working very hard in the background to make sure that they spread this awareness. And of course, it also starts at the top, right, with ensuring that policy speaks to these realities. So we're working at the policy level, but also our very vibrant and active youth civil society is working to spread this awareness amongst the youth as well. And so this platform provides them with the tools to do that. Yeah.
I know that you touched on a little bit earlier on this, but I wouldn't mind if you added more. When we talk about, specific examples of how this tobacco control data initiative has influenced or shaped policy decisions, legislative proposals, or public health campaigns in countries where it has been used, I know you did touch a little bit on this, but are there any other, and I love the fact that, there are other places, perhaps maybe that you can share where this has worked effectively?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned that this initiative is across multiple countries. Zambia is one of 7 countries, so it's working it's active in South Africa, in Kenya, in Zambia, in Nigeria, in Ethiopia, Democratic Republic of Congo, and more recently in Senegal. So actually, one of the ways, and I don't know that this was necessarily the intention, but I think it also having this data which is collected in a very similar fashion across these different countries. One of the important things is it allows us to benchmark ourselves. How are our peers doing? Where are we versus where are they? What are they doing differently? So we look at issues around illicit trade, for example. Kenya, has managed to enact policy, has managed to, enact policy and reduce illicit trade, for example, while still having a very strong tobacco control law. So we see, as an example for Zambia, how can we do that? So that's one of the things that we've been able to achieve by having this regional kind of approach to tobacco control data. And then also you mentioned, you asked to your question on how else it's been used. I think something that's important to mention is that all the work that we do is grounded in the WHO framework for FCTC, Framework Convention for Tobacco Control. So everything we speak to is FCTC compliant. And by having this information, we're able to benchmark ourselves across that framework. How are we doing according to how we should be doing? So it gives us kind of like a target that we can see over time how we're moving, which is very important so that we can know ultimately if we're going in the right direction. When we talk about issues around the FCTC is very clear around issues around like tobacco industry interference, right? So the dashboard makes it very clear. We showcase information around how are we doing around those issues. There's an index that's been created that's showcased, and we can see over time how Zambia is faring. And unfortunately, right now, it's not trending very well. But we can see once maybe we have some positive action in terms of policy, how that will trend. So we'll be able to see over time and create a narrative over time that will be very useful. Yeah, that's to answer your question.
Okay. Now, obviously, tobacco control often involves navigating complex industry tactics. How does the Tobacco Control Data Initiative platform help stakeholders understand and counter tobacco industry strategies and interferences? I know this has been a long-standing battle.
Yeah. So the issue of industry interference, I think I've mentioned that there's a standalone theme on the dashboard where we look at industry interference. And I think importantly, what it does is it actually explains what industry interference is and the different ways in which it manifests. Because I think we know that we can't control something that we don't understand. So I know there's a lot of efforts by CSOs to monitor industry interference, monitor, report, and I think it starts with them fully understanding what that is. And I think that's something that the dashboard does very well. And now, once it defines what it is, it also provides known and proven strategies of how these can be counted. Examples of how it's also manifested in Zambia, locally relevant examples are also showcased on the dashboard that can be verified and that are cited with sources. So that we know that at the end of the day, there is some level of transparency around what is actually happening. We're not just saying, oh, there's industry interference. We're actually showing, how it manifests, and then giving our civil society community with tools to address it.
What are some of the biggest challenges in gathering, standardizing, and verifying tobacco-related data across different countries, and how does the Tobacco Control Data Initiative address these challenges?
Yeah, so it's a very big challenge because I think tobacco use data is not collected consistently. So even just definitions, you can find that in one study, people are collecting data on tobacco smoking, and then the study is repeated after a few years, and they're collecting data on tobacco use. So now, how are you comparing? It's not quite the same. Tobacco smoking is a type of use, but there's smokeless, there's other types of tobacco use. So just the inconsistencies in the data make it really challenging. But I think we've been able to kind of navigate this as effectively as we can. Of course, share what our limitations are where they exist. And in some cases, actually, we've been able to where there's specific gaps in data, we've been able to collect primary data and actually fill those gaps. And we've done this across all the different countries where we've worked, including Zambia. We recently concluded a prevalence study on tobacco and nicotine use in 2 provinces. So Southern Province, which is a low prevalence setting, and Lapula Province, which is a high prevalence setting. So this we envision would be some sort of a sentinel, and these would be like sentinel sites where we can monitor how that prevalence evolves over time. So these are some of the innovative ways that we're looking at addressing some of the challenges around the inconsistencies in data. But I think one thing I will say is that there's a lot of research going into tobacco use and in tobacco control in general. And so I think this is something that with over time, because this is not something that is just, like a moment in time, over time, we'll see some improvements even in the quality of the data. And I think it will reflect very positively on what we showcase.
I think it's actually a very good thing that you're on this platform, and I believe our viewers will be privileged to be able to learn this firsthand from you. So, talking about what you've just mentioned, the 2 provinces that you're looking at, what are some of the major drivers of the outcomes that you observed in those? High prevalence, low prevalence. What are some of the major drivers in?
Yeah. So I think, the factors that contribute to, smoking initiation. I think a big thing that we've seen, because this actually, I'm glad you asked that question because it wasn't just a quantitative study that we did. We also did a qualitative study where we had focus group discussions. So I think societal acceptance is a very big driver of whether somebody makes that decision to even start smoking. So we find that in environments or communities where people are just less tolerant of smoking and it's got more negative connotations, people just won't start doing it. Or if they start doing it, it's not something that they'll just, it's not a convenient habit, so to speak, versus where there's wide acceptance. It's just one of those things we do. It's almost seen as cultural. There'll be a higher uptake, which is understandable. So I think it showcases the importance, the complexity of the issue, and how beyond just kind of issues around, taxation, etc., there'll really need to be deliberate efforts to drive behavior change, and I think having the data and this information gives us what we need in order to target those interventions and the initiatives better in the future.
I've always wondered whenever we talk about tobacco control and whenever we talk about consumption, like what has changed? I remember growing up, like I couldn't buy a cigarette for anybody. And the way that we perceived smoking was okay, you probably have to be old before you would start indulging in this practice. That's the perception that we had. So, what really has changed?
So that's a very good question, and I'm glad you raised it. So I think firstly, there's even that's been your experience, but I also hear time and time again of people who were sent as small children to go buy a cigarette for their like an uncle or even a father, and that was maybe like their first introduction. They had a few puffs and out of curiosity, which children will have, right? So I think there's that aspect where I think that perception and belief of smoking actually is very different. It varies, from home to home, from community to community. But also, I think if we're talking about the passage of time, I think more recently with the onset and I guess I'll take the significant uptake of things like shisha. And this, vaping, and we've got all these nicotine pouches now, all these different products. They just don't seem as harmful. They don't smell as bad. There's flavors. So the tobacco industry has done a very good job of packaging what is still essentially a very dangerous product as less harmful. So I think that is what has changed. And that is actually the biggest threat and the biggest danger at the moment.
And the other thing, I mean, you've been in university and there's a whole lot that you've seen. But one of the things that I've noticed, having been to university as well, having interacted with different people, I could be wrong because my premise is not evidence based. It's just based on observation.
Yeah.
But what I've noticed is compared to the way things used to be 20 years ago, maybe, 25 years ago, we didn't have, I think, according to my observation, as many young women or young ladies smoking as we have now, because sometimes you even get shocked. Like, okay, this never used to be normal. How is this young lady just smoking?
Yeah, I guess the cultural norms have evolved, but yes, I think back to the point of some making the packaging of tobacco has also changed. It's not seen as this thing, this thing that men do, outside, this, go, it's the perception has changed around tobacco and it's been marketed very well. And this marketing is very intentional. It's not, we think it's just, they have been studies that have shown that the intentional marketing to women, to youth, is something that is happening in the background. And that's why we have to be very deliberate about making sure that our counter to that is just as effective and just as strong.
Interesting. So when it comes to enforcement of laws, say from even at the level of municipality, you think that in as much as we may be in the process where we've been for quite some time unnecessarily. I like to say it's like the children of Israel leaving, what's that place again? Egypt, going to, Canaan, okay? They took longer than necessary. So it's like Zambia has been on this journey longer than necessary, having the power to actually cut the journey short. But for some reason, we still have been on this journey. Do you think that whilst we're waiting for legislation to take its course, in Parliament, there should be deliberate implementation and enforcement of existing laws that can help to curtail this societal challenge that has a toll on public health?
I think to answer your question, we need to do both things. We do need to enact stronger legislation because I think, like I mentioned, Zambia has endorsed the WHO FCTC, that's the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control, but we have never domesticated its agenda, essentially. And this has led to the gaps that have led to this increased uptake of some of these products. So we need to be very aggressively thinking about how, we can get FCTC compliant. I think that remains a priority, in my opinion. But at the same time, yes, to your point, there are existing laws that we need to be enforcing as well. But I think the existing laws themselves, I think, have proved insufficient, unfortunately, to some extent. Because let me give you an example. We're one of not many countries that still allow selling of single sticks, right? And just that, when you look at if we were mandated that to smoke, you have to buy a whole pack, that automatically increases the cost. So a child on their way to school has less temptation, right? But a stick of, a cigarette is in some cases cheaper than a sweet. So that becomes problematic. So our existing laws are not sufficient, unfortunately, when we compare them to the FCTC standard. So we do actively need to, strengthen the legal the framework. But at the same time, yes, enforcement is very important, even of what exists, such as the ban of selling to minors, because we know if a minor can still go buy a cigarette, it's very unlikely that someone will even stop them.
I love the fact that you've mentioned the issue of strengthening because my question was emanating from a practical experience, just over the weekend, like a day ago or so, I was in a certain environment trying to watch some sports. And then all of a sudden, those of us that do not smoke are a bit sensitive,
Right.
So we started noticing the air in that environment started changing. Like there was this, certain flavor. We're like, "Mm-mm, this is not oxygen. Oxygen doesn't smell like mint.
Right.
What is going on?" Then we realized that actually there was a whole lot of people that were vaping in that environment. So deliberately, I looked where the smoke was coming from and I went to the people and I said, "Look, you're not allowed to smoke in here because not all of us smoke. If you want to do your vaping, you can simply step outside and do that, And the gentleman was, gentlemanly. He obliged, apologized. And one young lady objected and said, "Okay, if I refuse, sir, what are you going to do about it?"
Right.
She was sarcastically, jokingly saying that, but I was like, "Look, I can't do anything to you," but I was merely pleading that you consider us who do not indulge, you know. But then it raised a question in my mind. It was like, okay, she's right. What if she just said, "I don't want to"? What can I do? It's different if I see somebody who's trying to steal from you.
Right.
I can try and enforce the law even as a civilian. I have the courage, I have the confidence. But what confidence and courage do I have as a civilian to approach somebody who's smoking in public and say, "You're not supposed to do this because you're not only endangering yourself, but even those around you"? So I think that is where that was actually coming from. Yeah. But anyway, moving on from there, looking ahead and still going back to the Tobacco Control Data Initiative and how it is evolving, particularly with the TCDI 3.0 to sustain and expand its impact on tobacco control policy across Africa. Just tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, so I think we started out with our focus on the platform when what I would call TCDI 1.0 was really establishing the platform, building it from the ground up, validating the information with our stakeholders, etc. And then we've evolved now to TCDI 2.0, where we're in continuously strengthening the information and the platform itself and updating the content, but also making sure that it continues to be a reliable, trusted, and used source by our stakeholders, our primary stakeholder being, government. So we've continued our efforts to engage, and we've continued our efforts also to make it more usable. I think you've asked a few questions alluding to how do we make sure that people actually access and get this information. And I think that speaks to making it increasingly more usable. There's technology and other aspects that have come in which can continue to, strengthen the platform. And we look forward to kind of seeing how we can use technology to continue to drive that. Yes, and so sustainability is a big part of it as well. We've partnered, locally with CTPD, who is taking the platform on going forward as our local sustainability partner, to make sure that it continues to be a useful, trusted source for the data. And yeah, that's what I can speak to in terms of challenge. But going forward, I think you can expect that we'll work on it. And
All right. So talking about, strategic partnerships, what role do you believe collaborations between data initiatives like the Tobacco Control Data Initiative itself, governments, public health institutions, and international partners play in achieving stronger public health outcomes?
so, yeah, collaboration is really important in achieving public health outcomes. Stronger collaboration leads to better informed decision making and better informed decisions ultimately, which leads to more accountability even for these decisions. And ultimately, that's what leads to better health outcomes. Because I think once people have a stake in something doing well, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think it all starts with effective collaboration. I think we all bring different things to the table. So in the case of TCDI, we come in with the data, but we rely on our civil society partners to actually advocate, use this data to actually advocate, and then also provide us with feedback of what they need to actually, get what they need done. Ultimately, the policymakers also are really important because they are the ones who are charged with actually making the decisions. And of course, there's, international organizations like the WHO, which provide us with an anchor and the frameworks that we need to also, make these informed decisions. So I think collaboration is really at the core of what we do. And I think TCDI is very much grounded in collaboration.
As we unfortunately get to wrap up this conversation, there's something that I got exposed to. I don't know how, authentic this is. Somebody told me about what they call data manipulation. In the age of technology, in the age of AI, people are investing in algorithms that would be countering the dashboard, for example. I just Google something to say benefits of tobacco, it quickly brings that particular platform where deliberately people have put information that would make people who are hooked to smoking feel like, actually, if I smoke 2 cigarettes a day, I'm okay. If I smoke, if I do a little bit of shisha here and there, I'm okay. So there's that component that is countering and fighting brilliant sources of information such as the TCDI. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we live in the age of misinformation. So I think such a platform is really trying to counter that by ensuring that we have credible data that's validated and that can be cited. I think at the end of the day, we are countering the misinformation that is ripe in our society, as you know, and particularly in tobacco control, we know that there's a lot of misinformation. So, yeah, I think there will continue to be efforts, especially with technology, which makes it easier to try and kind of derail derail the use of credible data and all of that. But I think that just kind of is our marching orders to be even just more vigilant. Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming through on the People Space podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So my guest has been Mbaita Maka, all the way from Gateway Development. She is Programs Manager. And today we were looking at the Tobacco Control Data Initiative, how it can be used to be able to further the agenda of tobacco control in Zambia. And beyond that, how it can strengthen advocacy and also contribute meaningfully to reducing the toll that excessive consumption has on the health sector. And one of the things that I'd like to close with when we are looking at this important topic is the enactment of the tobacco law itself. As Mbaita mentioned earlier on, I think I'll go back to my example earlier on of, the majority of stakeholders, including the general populace, being like the Israelites who are on their way to Egypt. There is a shortcut that can be taken, but unfortunately, we're using the longer route. So my appeal will go to the relevant authorities in this particular endeavor, the government of the day. I think we need to see political will not only in speeches, but in action to be able to see the strengthening of tobacco control in this country. And with initiatives like the TCDI, to be able to, I think, accomplish and achieve more than what it is already done so far, is if we see that law being enacted. So my challenge will go to the Moseses of this particular analogy. Where are you? When are you going to get us to the promised land? The name is Wenson Mavoro. Thank you for watching and see you next time.